You ever wonder what's up with grades in writing classes? Well, you didn't hear it from me, but here's the scoop. Now, I can neither confirm nor deny that I have spent any amount of time teaching a writing class, but we've all heard the complaints. People say, I understand my math grade, you either get the answer right or wrong, but writing is so subjective, it's just the teacher's opinion, those grades don't really mean anything. Today, I'm here to go anonymously on the record and say that the whole enterprise of teaching writing is a scam if it just boils down to your teacher's opinion. On some level, grades should be about evaluating what students are learning, and so if a writing grade is just your teacher's opinion, it's not really reflecting anybody's learning, and it is ultimately good for nothing. So if I were a writing teacher, I would really hope that the grades I was giving my students actually meant something, and luckily, writing isn't as purely subjective as we sometimes think. The fact is, you might be writing about your opinion, but that doesn't mean that the grade you get is just your teacher's opinion. But of course, there can be a lot of misunderstanding and frustration when it comes to grades, especially in writing classes, so I've been invited on the show today to talk about what goes into grading a paper and what that means for you. And that's the sort of real talk that we do here on the show, so if that's interesting to you, be sure to subscribe so that you can continue to learn things that will help you to understand and improve your own writing. It's worth taking some time to talk about the things that aren't being factored into your grade, because when it comes to writing, there are usually a lot of insecurities and anxieties that go into the process of writing a paper. And that's unfortunate, and it's not ideal, but it's also pretty common. We can get ourselves all wrapped up in worrying about things that aren't really important, and that can distract us from taking care of the things that really do matter. So, in order to save you some unnecessary worry, here are some things that aren't, or at least shouldn't, be affecting your grade. One of the amazing and sometimes troubling things about rhetoric is that it can be used to attack or defend literally any position. In fact, as we've mentioned before, some of the great speeches of the ancient rhetorical tradition were written just to practice defending an unpopular or even unusual position. The point here is that rhetoric doesn't care what your opinion is, so it shouldn't affect your grade. You can write a strong, compelling paper, even if you're writing about something that your teacher doesn't agree with. So don't get distracted trying to figure out your teacher's politics before you write your paper, because strictly speaking, it's just not going to matter. A teacher who's going to mark you down just for your opinion is someone who's more interested in teaching politics than writing. But of course, your teachers are humans just like you are, and so they might be more naturally inclined to find flaws in an argument that they disagree with. But just be aware that while your opinion itself shouldn't affect your grade, it may invite some extra scrutiny. But of course, if you know what you're doing rhetorically, that's not going to matter. I know, it's a writing class that we're talking about, but the fact of the matter is that basic academic writing classes are about learning how to write competently, not masterfully. So don't paralyze yourself thinking that your grade depends on having a writing style that would make a publishing executive swoon. Your only job is to make your point clearly and effectively. It can be really obvious and awfully distracting when a student tries to write impressively. More often than not, it fills your paper with unusual sentences and words that don't really mean what you want them to mean. As a result, your argument gets obscured, and that's something that can end up hurting your grade. It's a classic case of how focusing on the wrong thing can end up hurting you in the long run. Besides all that, writing classes haven't really been about grammar in a long time. Sure, you may lose some points here and there because of grammar, but the days of failing a paper because of commas are long gone. I had an experience once where I got a paper back with a pretty ugly C+ on it. Now, it may not be any sort of surprise to you, but even back then, writing had become a part of my identity. It was the one thing that I was best at, so that C+ sort of felt like a personal attack. Luckily, I had a good teacher that semester, and he took me aside to explain that that grade had nothing to do with my skill or identity as a writer. Instead, I just hadn't responded to the prompt in quite the right way. So I was thinking that that low grade meant that I was a bad writer, but really it just meant that my paper wasn't as good as it could have been. So in other words, it can be easy to forget that it's your paper and not you that's being graded. Now, we get the idea that grades in writing classes are purely subjective because we spend our time worrying about purely subjective things. But the truth is that good grading is focused on good writing technique, and that is a far more objective basis for grades than your opinions or your quality as a human being. Imagine for a minute that you're taking a math test. Yeah, you'll get points for getting the right answers, but chances are that your math teacher is also going to give you a lot of points just for showing your work and solving the problem in the right way. The steps you take on the way to the correct answer are often just as important, if not more important, than the answer itself. And something very similar is happening when you're writing a paper. The only real difference is that a rhetorical argument doesn't have a right answer in the same way that a math problem does. But a rhetorical argument can have a good answer, and that answer can be justified in a more or less effective way. That is, your grade on a paper is really about how well you show your work in responding to the prompt that your teacher has given you. So with that in mind, here are a few things that are being graded after you turn in your paper. Now this sounds pretty obvious, but it's really important to turn in the kind of writing that your teacher is asking you for. If the assignment asks for a rhetorical analysis, don't turn in a researched argument. If you're supposed to compare and contrast two different positions, don't write a long personal narrative describing how you feel about a topic. The fastest and easiest way to get a low grade on a paper is to turn in the wrong kind of paper. That's what happened on the paper that I didn't do too well on. The prompt asked for a detailed analysis of a disagreement that I had had with someone, and I turned in something more like a dramatic dialogue. My paper was creative and lyrical and everything that I thought a good paper should be, but it was just the wrong kind of paper, plain and simple. So pay close attention to what your teacher is asking you to do. If the prompt is asking for analysis, be sure that you're paying close attention to details and explaining how they fit together. If the assignment is asking for an argument, don't turn in a crown of sonnets. In exactly the same way that your math teacher is looking for you to show your work on a math problem, your writing teacher wants to see that each logical step in your thinking is valid and also visible within your paper. We've talked about showing work before, but it's worth repeating a little bit here. When you're writing a paper, your goal is not just to say what you know or what you believe. Rather, you also need to show how you know what you know and why you believe what you believe. It doesn't matter what your opinion is, but it does matter how you support your opinion. Your teacher doesn't need to make super subjective judgment calls to say that your claims are missing evidence or that a quotation hasn't been properly contextualized or interpreted. So put your thinking process explicitly on the page so that your readers and teacher can see clearly how you get from point A to point B in your thinking. You know about all the connections in your head, but your reader doesn't know about them unless you tell them. Skip steps in showing your logical work in your paper, and it's bound to be reflected in your grade. Now, you don't have to write like a best-selling author to get a good grade, but your writing should be clear enough to get your point across. Make sure, that is, that your words are actually saying what you mean. Like we were talking about earlier, there's nothing quite so obvious as a clumsy thesaurus substitution. Words that are synonyms have similar meanings, but not exactly the same meaning. It can be really easy to reach for a fancier word and end up with a word that doesn't really mean what you want it to. It's also pretty common to see papers that have sentences that no human being would ever say out loud. You know, sentences that don't make sense because they're missing words or because their words are in a crazy order. Now, it's understandable that if you're up late trying to crank out a paper and spending 15 minutes on a single sentence, you're bound to get tangled up in your thinking. You have to hold a lot of moving pieces in your head at the same time to write a clear sentence, and if it's taking a long time, it's easy to forget what you were doing when you started the sentence and end up changing strategies midway through. But if that kind of thing ends up in your final draft, it's going to affect your grade because your teacher isn't going to be able to tell what you're trying to say. You might have the best idea in the world, but it's not going to do anyone very much good if nobody can understand what you're writing. So I really recommend taking some time to read your paper out loud. I can't tell you how many times students go to office hours with messy sentences and a lot of heartburn. The easiest fix is usually just to ask them to say in their own words what it is that they're trying to write. Usually, people have an easier time saying what they mean than writing what they mean. So if you're not writing it the way that you would actually say it, it's probably a good sign that your sentences could use some clarification. Needless to say, we haven't covered everything that goes into grading because who's got the time? But we have talked about some key things to keep in mind as you write your paper and as you wait for it to be handed back. Our goal today was to help you to know what you don't need to worry about and what you should be paying attention to as you write your paper. But also, I wanted maybe to help promote some understanding between teachers and students. Grading can be a contentious mystery, but it doesn't have to be. It really is a pretty straightforward process. And if you know where your grades are coming from, you can adapt your writing to fit the situation, and that's what rhetoric is all about. So, will a writing grade ever be purely objective? Well, no, probably not, because when is anything that humans are involved in purely objective? Humans are subjective beings, and that's unavoidable, but it's also not really a problem either. Out there in the real world, subjective people with opinions and politics and values that are different from yours are going to be reading your papers and responding to them in subjective ways. So honestly, any subjectivity in your teacher is good preparation for the kind of subjectivity you'll find in your readers. At the same time though, writing is not just a subjective free-for-all. The more thoroughly and explicitly you explain yourself, the stronger your paper will be and the higher your grade will be. There are, in other words, specific things you can do to make your paper better, and writing teachers are trained to pay attention to those things. In fact, I've seen many teachers in training from various backgrounds grade the same paper and arrive at strikingly similar grades. And if grades were purely subjective, that just wouldn't happen. Of course, the institution of grading itself is full of controversy, but the point is that there are specific things you can do in your writing to improve your chances of getting a better grade. It really isn't all up to chance, though, of course, legally, I suppose I shouldn't make any guarantees. So, to conclude, the real gift you get when a teacher responds to your writing is information about how a trained and experienced reader and writer interacted with the paper that you wrote. Not only can they help you to understand how other readers might respond to what you've written, but they also have the knowledge and experience to explain why those readers might respond to your paper in that way, and to help you to understand what you can do in your writing to address those issues moving forward. Some of the very best teaching and writing classes happens in the comments and feedback that you get from your teachers on your actual papers. So pay close attention to what your teacher says and use their knowledge and experience to help you to improve your writing. And I suppose that's where we'll wrap up. Of course, you can't give us a grade, but you could give us a like. Also, leave your comments below so that we'll know how real viewers interacted with this video. And as always, share this video with someone you know to help them to become a better, happier writer. And we'll be seeing each other again real soon. Oh, don't worry, it's just me.